Hi everyone, this is Mrs. GA, and today we are going to talk about the property that corresponding parts of congruent figures are congruent. And a quick way to say that is CPCFC. So if you look below, it says if figure JKLM is congruent to figure PQRS, all of their corresponding parts are also congruent. So it's really important that we understand what corresponding parts are because those things are congruent and you need to know how to find them. So corresponding means that they are matching, they go together, and they are always going to be in the same relative position. So we've talked about the fact that the way you name a figure is going to be really important because we want to make sure the corresponding parts match. So if you say JKLM and then you say PQRS, that implies that J corresponds with P because they are in the same relative position. They're first. K goes with Q because they're in the same relative position, so on and so forth. And so to summarize, you can look down here. If two figures are congruent, then their corresponding sides and angles are also congruent, which makes sense. If two overall figures are the same, then everything about them, including the sides and the angles, should also be the same. Here are a few properties of congruence that we might use. So the reflective property of congruence states that any segment is congruent to itself. That seems a little bit obvious, but it still is a property. Here, the symmetric property of congruence says that if AB is congruent to CD, then CD is congruent to AB. That should say B. We have a little typo there. And this just says it doesn't matter which one you say first if they're congruent. And the transitive property of congruence says if AB is congruent to CD and CD is congruent to EF, AB must be congruent to EF. So if two things are congruent to the same thing, like here, they are also congruent to each other, which is really just a logical statement, but it is useful to know that it's called the transitive property of congruence. Okay, so let's look at number one together. So here we're given that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. So we're going to start by naming the congruent sides and the congruent angles, and we're going to use that CPCFC to do this. So I'm going to look again at the relative position. Since AB, so if AB comes first in my first triangle, I can say that it is congruent to DE, which would be the first two letters of our second triangle. If I say BC, again, look at the relative position. It's second and third. It must be congruent to EF. And last, if I say CA, it must be congruent to FD. So that is using the CPCFC. Okay, now let's do the same with angles. So again, if I'm starting with angle A, that's going to be congruent to the first angle in the other triangle, angle D. Angle B, since it's in the middle, would be congruent to angle E, also in the middle here. And angle C would be congruent to angle F. So you can see that I'm not even looking at the figure when I'm doing this. I'm looking at how my congruent statement is written, and that's all you need to know. From there, we can use these different congruent statements to help us find these different parts. So first, they want us to find the measure of angle A. So I'm going to start with this congruent statement. I'm going to say angle A is congruent to angle D. That's from right here. And I can see here that angle D is 75 degrees. So I can substitute that, and my final answer would be angle A. The measure of angle A is 75 degrees. So always start with a congruent statement. A is congruent with D, and then substitute for what you know. Let's try the same with DE. So I'm going to start with a congruent statement. I know that line segment DE is congruent to line segment AB. Well, I can see here that AB is 2.5, So now I can substitute that and say, oh, DE is also equal to 2.5 centimeters. All right, and last, they ask us to find the perimeter of the triangles. So let's use this side, but it is important that we know what perimeter means. So perimeter is just the sum of all sides. So since this is a triangle, it's the sum of all three sides. And again, we only need to find the perimeter of one because they are congruent, so it should be the same for both. So I'm going to start by making an equation. I'm going to say AB plus AC plus BC, so I said AB plus AC plus BC equals the perimeter. And now I can substitute what we know. So we know that AB is 2.5, and we know that BC is 3.9, and the only thing we're missing is AC. So if you look back at our congruent statements, we know that AC, or CA, is congruent to DF. So I can show that in my picture by doing this. I can make a single tick mark for both, showing that they're congruent. So I know that this is 3.2, and now I can put that in the middle. Now if we add all of these up, we end up with 9.6, and then we can use our units, centimeters. All right, let's look down at example 2. Here we're given triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. So first they would like us to find the measure of angle D. So I'm always going to start, I'm going to solve it down here. I'm always going to start with a congruent statement. I can state that angle D is congruent to angle A. Then I can look in my figures and I can substitute. I see that angle D is equal to 6y plus 16, and I see that angle A is 9y minus 2. So now all I need to do is solve. So I'm going to subtract 6y from both sides. I'm going to add 2 to both sides. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 3, so I get 6 equals y. Now, you have to look back at the original problem. They don't ask us to solve for y. We would like to find the measure of angle D. So again, we're going to start with a given statement. We'll say angle D equals 6y plus 16, and then we can substitute what we know. 6 times 6 plus 16. So angle D equals 36 plus 16. So the measure of angle D is 52 degrees. So again, on a test or quiz, I would definitely expect to see a congruence statement before you make your substitution. And I'd like you to also state given equations before you make your substitutions. All right, let's move on to part B. So here they are asking us to find AB. They would like us to find the length of AB. So I'm going to start with a congruent statement. I know that line segment AB, first to second, is congruent to line segment DE. So that would be my congruent statement. Okay, so now we can substitute what we know. We know that AB is 2x plus 5, and we know that DE is 3x. So now all we need to do is solve.